The room didn't explode when he said it. It tightened, like glass under pressure. Security. Remove her. No raised voices, no chaos. Just a decision, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the system would obey without hesitation. And for a second, it almost did. Chairs shifted, eyes dropped. Someone reached for their phone, not to help, but to avoid being seen choosing a side. Because moments like this aren't about noise. They're about alignment. Who stands still? Who moves? And who already moved 5 steps ahead? She didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even look at him. Just closed her laptop halfway. Not fully, not dramatically. Like someone pausing a process, not ending it. Then, almost casually, check your email. No emphasis, no tension, just timing. And that's when something changed. Not in the room, but underneath it. Because when a decision feels absolute, but someone responds like it isn't, it usually means the decision isn't the real center of control. And 6 minutes later, that assumption would become very expensive. The word security didn't echo. It settled. Heavy, procedural, final. 2 men by the door shifted their posture almost in sync, like a system receiving a command it had executed 100 times before. Not aggressive, not hesitant. Just inevitable. That's how these rooms work. Not through force, through expectation. You don't question authority when it sounds routine. And the VP knew that. His tone wasn't loud, wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. It carried something more efficient. Certainty. Across the table, someone exhaled quietly. Another adjusted their tie. A laptop screen dimmed as if even the device understood this wasn't a moment to stay visible. Because no one wanted to be the one still looking when it happened. But she didn't move. Not immediately. There's a specific kind of stillness that appears in moments like this. Not frozen, not shocked. Calibrated. Measured against something no one else in the room can see yet. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the laptop. Not gripping, not defensive. Just placed there, like an anchor to a timeline that had already started running. The first guard took a step forward, and that's when she lifted her gaze. Not toward the VP, toward the screen at the far end of the table, the one connected to the shared system dashboard. Numbers still flickered there, indifferent, precise. Revenue streams, exposure models, active contracts ticking like quiet machinery beneath polished surfaces. Everything looked stable, which in environments like this usually means something critical is about to shift. "You're making a procedural error," she said. No accusation, just a statement. Clean, almost administrative. The VP didn't even blink. "I'm making a decision." A slight smile, thin and controlled, the kind that signals closure, not discussion. Because in his version of the moment, this was already done. He didn't see risk. He saw resolution. And that distinction was about to cost him. The guard was closer now. Close enough for the movement to feel real, not theoretical. Close enough that the room collectively leaned away. Not physically, but perceptually. Distance in these situations is psychological. No one intervenes. No one interrupts. Because intervention implies responsibility, and responsibility is expensive. She turned her screen slightly, not to show anyone. Just enough that the angle shifted, a small, almost invisible adjustment. Then she pressed a key. Not dramatically, not even noticeably, but the system responded. Somewhere, not in the room, not on that visible dashboard. A process completed. A message delivered. A file unlocked. A sequence activated. The VP exhaled as if concluding something administrative. "Escort her out." Final tone, no friction, no doubt. And for a fraction of a second, it worked. The room accepted it. Because authority, when unchallenged, becomes architecture. It defines the boundaries of what's possible, what's allowed, what's already decided. But architecture has one weakness. It assumes the foundation is intact. Across the table, the CFO hadn't moved much during the exchange. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. CFOs don't react quickly. They validate. They observe patterns, not moments. And right now, something in the pattern had shifted. A soft vibration against the polished wood surface, barely audible. But in a room calibrated to silence, it cut through like a signal. The CFO glanced down. One notification. No urgency in the motion, just habit. But habits, in the wrong moment, open doors. He tapped the screen, paused, and then something subtle changed in his posture. Not dramatic, not visible to most, but precise. Like someone adjusting their weight after realizing the ground isn't where they thought it was. The guards were still moving. The VP was already looking past her. And the room was still operating on a version of reality that was 6 minutes behind. Because the message she sent wasn't for him. It wasn't for the room. It was for the only person there who understood that decisions don't carry weight, unless the numbers agree. And right now, the numbers had just started speaking. And when they do, they don't ask for permission. They redefine it. And the moment the CFO looked up again, the room was no longer aligned the way it had been seconds before. Not visibly. Not yet. But structurally. And that kind of shift? It doesn't announce itself. It waits. Right until the exact second it becomes impossible to ignore. Stay close. The next move isn't louder. It's sharper. The CFO didn't speak immediately. That alone was enough to fracture the rhythm of the room. Because silence in this context wasn't absence. It was processing. His eyes didn't move quickly across the screen. They slowed down. Line by line, section by section, not searching, verifying. And that distinction is where control begins to shift. The guards were now within arm's reach, close enough that the next second would no longer be reversible. The VP didn't look at them, didn't need to. Execution was already in motion, and in his mind, nothing in that room held the authority to interrupt it. Except something just had. A subtle shift in breathing from the far end of the table. Someone noticed. Then someone else. It spreads like that. Not as a reaction, but as a recalibration. People don't know what changed yet, but they feel that something did. The CFO leaned back slightly, not away from the table, away from assumption. His thumb hovered over the screen for half a second longer than necessary. Then he looked up. Not at her. At the VP. Where did this come from? Neutral tone. No accusation, no volume. But the question wasn't about origin. It was about legitimacy. The VP frowned, just slightly. Annoyance, not concern. At this point, that's not relevant. A mistake? Small. Almost invisible. But critical. Because in rooms like this, the moment someone declares something not relevant, they've already lost control of it. The CFO didn't respond immediately. He turned the screen slightly, just enough that the angle caught the overhead light. A reflex, a habit, but also a signal. I disagree. Still calm, still measured, but now anchored. The guards slowed, not because anyone told them to, because uncertainty entered the system, and uncertainty interrupts execution faster than any command. What exactly are you disagreeing with? The VP asked, sharper now, not louder, tighter, compressed. Because something he couldn't see yet had already begun to define the room. The CFO's gaze didn't shift. Risk exposure. 2 words, that's all it took. And suddenly the air changed density, because risk, unlike authority, doesn't negotiate. It quantifies. He tapped the screen once. Not to scroll, to highlight. 30 million. No emphasis, no dramatics. Just a number placed on the table like a structural load. And the room felt it. Someone's chair creaked. Another person finally looked up. Because numbers like that don't belong to individuals. They belong to consequences. The VP's expression didn't collapse, but it tightened. Microseconds, micro adjustments, the kind you only notice if you're trained to read them. That's a projection, he said, controlled, dismissive, attempting to reframe. Another mistake. Because the CFO didn't argue. He clarified. It's a validated exposure. And then a pause. Just long enough to let the difference settle. Projection can be ignored. Validated exposure cannot. The guard stopped completely. No command, no signal. Just stopped. Because at some level, even they understood. This was no longer a personnel issue. This was financial gravity. And gravity overrides instruction. The CFO placed the phone flat on the table. Not hidden, not protected, visible, transparent. Because once data enters the room like this, it doesn't belong to one person anymore. It belongs to the outcome. Your decision, he continued, eyes still on the VP, invalidates 3 active protections tied to her access. No aggression, no escalation, just structure, laid out piece by piece. And if those protections collapse, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Because now everyone in the room was finishing it themselves. And what they were imagining was expensive. Very expensive. The VP opened his mouth, closed it, recalculated, because authority works best when it's uninterrupted. But now it was intersecting with something more rigid, more precise, more dangerous. Logic. And logic doesn't raise its voice. It removes options. Across the table, someone slowly closed their laptop. Another leaned forward, elbows touching the surface for the first time. Engagement had returned, but not to him, to the data. And that's when the real shift became visible. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The VP was no longer leading the room. He was catching up to it. She hadn't moved this entire time, still standing where she was, still calm, still outside the urgency, because she wasn't reacting to the moment. She had already defined it. And now the room was arriving there, piece by piece. 6 minutes. That's all it took. Not to stop a decision, but to expose what that decision actually meant. And once meaning enters the room, authority has to renegotiate itself. Or break. Stay with this. Because what happens next isn't a reversal. It's a correction. If you've ever watched a decision feel final, only to realize it wasn't built on the full picture, pause for a second. In your environment, what looks like authority, but actually depends on something deeper? Because real control rarely announces itself. It sits in systems, in access, in details no one questions, until they have to. And when those details surface, everything shifts without a single raised voice. No one gave a new command. And yet, everything stopped. Not visibly. Not in a way you could point to and say there, that's the moment. But in rooms like this, movement isn't always physical. It's directional. And the direction had just changed. The guard stepped back half a pace. Subtle, professional, almost unnoticeable. But it broke the illusion. Because until that second, the room still believed in a single line of execution. Decision to action to outcome. Now there was a gap. And gaps are dangerous. They invite review. The VP noticed it. Of course he did. He turned slightly. Not fully toward the guards, not fully toward the CFO. Just enough to recalibrate his position in the room. Control doesn't disappear instantly. It erodes. You're overreacting, he said, voice steady, almost instructional now. Not defensive. Not yet. This is internal. Another miscalculation, because the CFO didn't answer the tone. He answered the structure. It stopped being internal the moment the exposure crossed contractual thresholds. No emphasis, no need, just alignment with rules that existed long before anyone in the room made a decision. And rules like that don't bend. A faint click echoed as someone, somewhere along the table, locked their screen. A signal, again. Small, but precise. People weren't disengaging anymore. They were repositioning. The CFO tapped the phone once more, then rotated it fully, placing the screen face up toward the center of the table. An invitation. Or a warning. Depends how you read it. Columns, figures, risk mapping, clean, structured, unemotional. And right there, highlighted in a narrow band of light, $30 million exposure triggered by unauthorized access termination. No narrative, no interpretation, just consequence. The VP's eyes moved across it quickly this time. Too quickly. Because speed in moments like this isn't efficiency, it's resistance. That assumes the dependency is active, he replied. A pivot, attempting to reframe the variable. But the CFO was already ahead of that line. It is. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, because she never decommissioned it. And suddenly, every glance in the room shifted, not toward the VP, toward her. For the first time since the moment began. She didn't react to it, didn't step forward, didn't explain. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, as if the weight of the room had nothing to do with her. Which, in a way, it didn't. Because she wasn't holding the control. She had already placed it somewhere no one else thought to look. The VP leaned forward now, both hands on the table. A physical move, grounding, reasserting presence. Then we disable it, he said. Direct, simple, actionable. Finally, something that sounded like control again. But the CFO didn't move, didn't even blink. You can't. 2 words, clean, absolute. And this time, they didn't just land, they settled. Why not? The VP asked. Short, compressed. Because the room was no longer giving him time to expand. The CFO's gaze shifted briefly to the screen, then back. Because it's not tied to her access anymore. Silence. Not the earlier kind. This one had structure, weight, edges. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for sound to fill it. It waits for understanding. And understanding in this case came fast. Too fast. Someone inhaled sharply. Another leaned back as if distance could soften what they were starting to calculate. Because if the system wasn't tied to her, then removing her didn't solve anything. It exposed something. And exposure at this scale is never contained. The VP straightened slowly, not defeated, not yet, but recalibrating at a level deeper than posture. Then what exactly are we looking at? He asked. And for the first time, it wasn't a statement. It was a request. The CFO didn't answer immediately. He let the question exist in the room for a second longer than comfortable, because timing here mattered more than content. Then, you're looking at a live dependency. A beat. One that continues, regardless of personnel. Another beat. And one that just flagged external review conditions. There it was, the line no one wanted to cross. External. Because internal issues can be managed, contained, reframed. But external conditions? They escalate. They formalize. They leave records. And records? Don't forget. The VP's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the system. Finally. And that's when it became clear. The decision he made 6 minutes ago was never the real event. This was. Because now, the room wasn't deciding what to do with her. It was deciding how to survive what had already been triggered. And that shift? It doesn't ask permission. It rewrites the agenda. Stay close. Because once a room starts asking the wrong question, the answer is already too expensive to avoid. The room didn't return to order. It redefined it. Not through instruction, not through hierarchy, through alignment with something far less negotiable. Consequence. The screen at the center of the table remained still. No flashing alerts, no dramatic escalation, just structured data, sitting there with quiet certainty. And that was the problem. Because nothing in it needed interpretation anymore. It had already been interpreted. External review conditions. Someone repeated under their breath. Not a question. A realization. The kind that arrives fully formed, like a conclusion your mind reaches before you're ready to accept it. The VP straightened, slow and deliberate. Control again, or at least the appearance of it. We contain it, he said. Clear, decisive, familiar. The kind of language that usually restores momentum, but not this time, because containment assumes boundaries, and what had just been exposed had none that the room could enforce. The CFO didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. He simply reached forward and scrolled. One movement, and the room followed. Not by choice, by gravity. Clause alignment, he said. 3 sections appeared, clean, referenced, cross-linked. Each one tied to the same trigger. Each one activated by the same action. Termination of access. Her access. A quiet inhale moved across the table like a ripple. Because now it wasn't just a number. It was a structure. Legal, financial, operational, interlocked, and already in motion. You're saying this escalates automatically? Someone asked. Careful tone, measured, as if the phrasing itself could soften the answer. The CFO didn't soften anything. I'm saying it already did. And just like that, time in the room split, before and after. The VP's hand pressed flat against the table, a grounding move again. But this time, it didn't stabilize anything. It revealed pressure. Then we reversed the decision, he said. Faster now, more direct. Because control, when threatened, seeks speed. Undo, reapply, correct. But the CFO's response came just as quickly. You can't reverse a triggered clause. No pause, no hesitation. Because this wasn't opinion. It was mechanism. The VP's eyes flicked to her. For the first time, not dismissive, not authoritative, evaluative. And that's when the room noticed something else. She hadn't reacted once. Not to the guards, not to the commands, not to the escalation, because she wasn't part of the reaction chain. She was upstream of it. What did you build? The VP asked. Low, controlled, but no longer in charge. She tilted her head slightly, not as a gesture, as a calibration. A system that follows its rules, she said. Simple, almost too simple. But in rooms like this, simplicity is rarely basic. It's distilled. And those rules, she continued, don't pause for decisions. Silence again. But this time, no one expected it to break quickly, because now the room wasn't waiting for authority. It was waiting for options. And options were limited. The CFO leaned back slightly, not disengaging, framing. Best case, he said, we stabilize the exposure through compliance acknowledgement. Technical, structured, safe. Including? Someone asked. And now, the question everyone had been avoiding. The CFO didn't look at the VP. He looked at her. Reinstatement of access. There it was. Not a recommendation, a requirement. The VP exhaled slowly, not sharply, Not angrily, but with the kind of controlled release that signals internal recalculation. Because the room had fully shifted now. The sequence had inverted. Decision no longer led. Consequence did. He looked around the table. For alignment. For support. For something that would restore the original structure. But what he found instead was distance. Not physical. Structural. People weren't opposing him. They were aligning with the only stable element left. The system. And systems don't negotiate with ego. They resolve around logic. He nodded once. Small. Contained. But enough. Restore her access, he said. Different tone now. Not command. Compliance. The guards stepped back completely. No longer needed. Never really were. She didn't move immediately. Again, that same precise stillness. Because timing for her wasn't reaction. It was control. Then she reached forward, opened the laptop fully this time, and typed. A few keystrokes. Nothing dramatic. But the system responded. You could feel it before you saw it. A shift in posture across the table. Screens lighting up. Notifications aligning. Not louder. Just synchronized. The CFO glanced down at his phone again. Scrolled once. Stopped. Then nodded. Exposure contained. 3 words, and just like that. The room exhaled. Not relief. Not fully. But release from escalation. The kind that comes when something stops getting worse. The VP leaned back. Not victorious. Not defeated. Repositioned. Because what had just happened wasn't a reversal. It was a correction enforced by something he couldn't override. And that realization? It doesn't fade quickly. Across the table, someone quietly reopened their laptop. Another adjusted their posture, returning to a version of normal that no longer quite fit. Because once a room sees how control actually works, it never fully unsees it. She closed the laptop again. Gently, deliberately, not ending anything. Just concluding her part. And for a moment, no one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't feel smaller than what had just been demonstrated. Stay with this. Because the final layer isn't about what changed in the system. It's about what changed in them. No one rushed to speak. That, more than anything, marked the shift. Because before, words filled space quickly. Decisions moved fast. Authority sounded confident because it didn't need to wait. Now, everything waited. Not out of hesitation, out of recalculation. The screen at the center of the table dimmed slightly, as if the system itself had stepped back, no longer needing to prove anything. It had already done its job. The CFO placed his phone face down. A quiet gesture. Closure, but also acknowledgement. The event had passed, but its implications hadn't. Across the table, someone cleared their throat. Soft, unnecessary. A reflex, not a signal. Because the room wasn't looking for someone to resume control anymore. It was adjusting to the fact that control had never been where they thought it was. The VP didn't move for a few seconds longer than expected. Then finally, he leaned forward. Not sharply, not to assert, to understand. What else is tied to it? He asked. No edge, no authority, just precision. Because once a system proves it can override you, you don't challenge it again. You map it. She looked at him, directly this time. Not confrontational, not distant. Aligned. Everything that matters, she said. A quiet answer, but not vague. Because in that room, everyone understood what everything meant. Revenue flows, contract triggers, continuity safeguards, the invisible architecture that keeps decisions from becoming disasters. And now, they knew exactly where that architecture lived. Not in titles, not in roles, in design. The VP nodded once. Not agreement, recognition. A small but critical distinction. Because recognition doesn't restore status. It recalibrates it. Around the table, posture shifted again. But this time, it wasn't defensive. It was attentive. People weren't protecting their positions anymore. They were studying the system that had just corrected them. "How long has it been like this?" someone asked. Careful again. Measured, because the answer mattered more than the question. She didn't hesitate. "Long enough." A faint ripple moved across the room, because that answer didn't point to a moment. It pointed to intent. Design doesn't happen accidentally, and systems like that aren't built overnight. The CFO leaned back slightly, folding his hands, a rare pause in his otherwise linear presence. Then, almost quietly, "It's compliant." Not praise, not approval, validation. The highest form of acceptance in a room like this, because compliance means defensible, auditable, survivable. And in this moment, that was the only metric that mattered. The VP exhaled again, but this time it wasn't tension leaving. It was resistance. And once resistance leaves, clarity enters. "We'll need full visibility," he said. Different language now. Not directive. Request structured as necessity. She nodded once. Minimal. Precise. "You already have it," she replied. And that was the final shift. Because visibility, in most systems, is something granted. Here, it had always been present. They just hadn't known where to look. Silence settled again, but softer now, less rigid, because the room had transitioned from control to understanding, from assumption to structure. And in that transition, something subtle but irreversible had happened. Authority didn't disappear. It relocated. Not to her. Not to the CFO. To the system itself. The VP looked around the table one last time. Not to lead. To confirm. And what he saw wasn't opposition. It was alignment. Not with him. With reality. He nodded. Once. Final. "We proceed within constraints," he said. And no one challenged it. Because constraints now weren't limitations. They were protection. She closed the laptop. For the last time. Not as a gesture. As a conclusion. The system would continue. It always would. Independent. Consistent. Unaffected by tone, position, or urgency. And as the room slowly returned to motion, papers adjusted, screens reopened, chairs shifted, something remained. Unspoken. But fully understood. This wasn't a story about someone being removed, or reinstated, or corrected. This was a demonstration of where real control lives. Not in decisions, not in voices, not in moments that look final. But in the quiet architecture underneath, the part that doesn't argue, doesn't react, and never ever moves until everything else aligns with it. No one tried to reclaim the moment. That was the clearest signal of all. Because in rooms built on hierarchy, someone usually fills the silence, reasserts direction, reframes what just happened, restores the illusion of uninterrupted control. Here, no one did. The system had already spoken, and it had spoken with precision. The CFO's phone remained face down now, no longer a source of information, but a closed loop. Whatever needed to be validated already was. Across the table, screens came back to life one by one. Not urgently, not chaotically, measured, like a system rebooting, not because it failed, but because it had just corrected itself. The VP didn't rush to speak. That, in itself, was new. A few minutes ago, his voice defined direction. Now, he was choosing words carefully, not out of weakness, out of awareness. "What dependencies remain active?" he asked. Clean, technical, no ego left in it, only structure. Because once authority meets a system, it can't override. It adapts or it fractures. She met his glad steadily. "Only the ones designed to stay active," she said. A precise answer. Nothing extra. Nothing exposed. but enough. Because in that sentence was an entire architecture: selective persistence, controlled continuity, boundaries that don't collapse under pressure. The VP nodded slowly. Not approval. Alignment. A different kind of authority. One that doesn't dominate but integrates. Around the table, posture shifted again. But this time it wasn't tension. It was focus. People leaned in, not to defend positions, but to understand the structure that had just redirected an entire decision in under 6 minutes. That report, someone began, then stopped. Because even the question felt redundant. Everyone already knew. The report wasn't a reaction. It was a trigger. Pre-built, pre-aligned, waiting. The CFO finally spoke again, quietly. It was timed. Not a guess, a conclusion. And the room absorbed it instantly. Because timing like that doesn't happen by accident. It requires design. And design implies intent. All eyes shifted, again, to her. But this time, not out of scrutiny, out of recognition. She didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. She simply stood there, exactly as she had from the beginning. Calm, precise, outside the urgency that had consumed everyone else. Because she had never been inside that urgency. She had been ahead of it. The VP leaned back slightly, not retreating, reframing. "We proceed differently," he said. Not a command, a correction. And no one questioned it. Because now differently had a definition. It meant no decisions without dependency mapping, no actions without structural validation, no authority without alignment with the system beneath it. And in that moment, the hierarchy didn't collapse. It evolved. The CFO gave a small nod. Agreement, validation, closure. And with that, the meeting didn't end dramatically. It dissolved. Quietly. People returned to their screens. Notes were adjusted. Tasks resumed. But not the same way. Because once you've seen how control actually works, you don't go back to guessing. She closed her laptop. One final soft motion. Not symbolic. Operational. Her role in this sequence was complete. The system would continue. Independent, stable, unbothered by tone or title. And as she turned toward the door, no one stopped her. No one needed to. Because the room had already understood something irreversible. She was never the variable. She was the reference point. And the real power in that room was never in the order to remove her. It was in the architecture that made that order irrelevant.